Look down at your own hand for a second. 5 fingers, a thumb that can press against each one of them, letting you grip a cup, turn a key, or hold the device you're using right now. That hand is not a recent invention. Its basic blueprint is at least 60 million years old, shaped inside small, frightened animals hiding in the branches of trees, during a period when almost every large animal on the planet had just been wiped out in one of the most catastrophic single events in the history of life on Earth. If those small animals hadn't been hiding in those particular trees, if that catastrophe hadn't unfolded in exactly the way it did, there would be no hand for you to look down at right now. So here's the question worth sitting with for the next few minutes. What really died that day, and why did its death have to happen before yours ever could? To answer that, you have to go back much further than the disaster itself. You have to understand what the world looked like before everything changed, because the story of your existence doesn't start with an ending. It starts with something so successful, so dominant, that its eventual disappearance should have seemed almost impossible. Dinosaurs first appeared more than 230 million years ago, and by the time this story really begins, they had already ruled every continent on Earth for over 165 million years. To put that in perspective, Homo sapiens, our species, has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Dinosaurs were the dominant land animals on this planet for more than 500 times longer than we've existed in any form at all. They weren't a footnote waiting to be replaced. They were the main event. Some were smaller than a chicken, some were longer than 3 school buses parked end to end. And one entire branch of the dinosaur family had already sprouted feathers and taken to the sky, the ancestors of every bird alive today. There was no sign, anywhere in the fossil record, that this dynasty was coming to an end. Underneath that story, quietly, a second one was unfolding. Mammals had already existed for tens of millions of years, evolving right alongside the dinosaurs the entire time. But they weren't thriving, they were surviving. Most were small, some no bigger than a mouse. Growing evidence suggests many of them were active mainly at night, when the giant reptiles that ruled the daylight hours were less of a threat. For well over 100 million years, the entire mammalian survival strategy came down to 3 things: stay small, stay hidden, stay alive. Nothing about that quiet, background existence looked like the beginning of anything important. It looked like a dead end. For a long time, nobody actually knew what had ended the age of dinosaurs. It was one of the great open mysteries in science. Then, in 1980, a geologist and his physicist father noticed something strange in rock layers from that exact moment in time, sampled from sites all over the world. A thin band of clay containing unusually high levels of a rare element called iridium, an element that's scarce on Earth's surface, but far more common in asteroids. At first, most scientists dismissed the idea, but over the next decade, more evidence surfaced, including the discovery of a massive, buried crater off the coast of what is now Mexico. The extinction of the dinosaurs stopped being a mystery. It became a crime scene, and the evidence had been sitting in the rock layers, in plain sight, the entire time. Roughly 66 million years ago, an object from space, somewhere around the size of a mountain, slammed into the coast of what is now Mexico, traveling many times faster than a rifle bullet. The energy released is almost impossible to translate into human terms. It vaporized rock instantly. It triggered earthquakes far more powerful than anything in recorded human history. It sent a wall of ocean water racing outward, tall enough to swallow buildings. And that was only the first few minutes. Massive volcanic eruptions on the other side of the planet, in what's now India, may have already been putting the global ecosystem under strain before the asteroid ever arrived, weakening the world's resistance to whatever came next. What came next made it fatal. Debris blasted into the atmosphere rained back down across the entire planet, and many researchers believe the heat from that re-entry was intense enough to ignite fires across large parts of the world, though scientists still debate exactly how widespread those fires really were. Dust and sulfur, thrown miles into the sky, spread across the globe and blocked out the sun. Not for a day, not for a week, for months, and quite possibly years. Without sunlight, plants died. Without plants, the animals that ate them starved. Without those animals, the predators that hunted them had nothing left to hunt. It wasn't really the impact itself that ended the age of dinosaurs. It was starvation, unfolding on a planetary scale, that finished what the impact started. So why mammals? Out of everything that could have made it through that darkness, why were these small, unremarkable creatures among the ones still standing when the sun finally broke through again? The honest answer has almost nothing to do with strength, speed, or intelligence. It comes down to something far less dramatic: how little you needed to survive. A massive plant-eating dinosaur might have needed hundreds of pounds of vegetation every single day just to stay alive. When the plants disappeared, so did they, and so did everything that depended on hunting them. A small mammal, weighing about as much as a modern rat, could survive on a tiny fraction of that. Insects, buried seeds, even the decaying remains of everything that had just died around it. Many appear to have sheltered underground, away from the worst of the heat and debris. The very traits that had made mammals seem irrelevant for over 160 million years, their size, their plainness, their willingness to eat almost anything and hide almost anywhere, turned out to be exactly what the end of the world required. Birds tell a strikingly similar story. Nearly every winged dinosaur species vanished in the aftermath. But ground-dwelling birds that could peck seeds out of the ash survived, and their descendants are the birds still outside your window today. Across the board, survival had almost nothing to do with dominance. It had everything to do with needing less. When the skies finally cleared, the planet on the other side was almost unrecognizable. The largest, most successful land animals in Earth's history were simply gone, and every ecological role they used to fill, top predator, giant herbivore, mid-sized scavenger, was suddenly and violently vacant. Nature does not tolerate a vacuum for long. Within just a few million years, an almost instantaneous window by geological standards, mammals that had spent over 100 million years staying small and staying quiet began doing something they'd rarely been allowed to do before: grow, spread, and specialize. Some became fast, agile predators. Some grew large and slow, feeding on plants at a scale no mammal ever had before. It's one of the fastest bursts of evolutionary change in the entire fossil record, and it only happened because the animals that used to prevent it were no longer there to stop it. This is the part of the story most people skip past, but it might be the most important part of all. Somewhere inside that explosion of new mammal life, in forests that were only just beginning to recover, a very particular kind of creature was about to appear. Small, quick, living almost entirely in the trees. And it would carry, in its body and its behavior, the earliest version of the hand you looked down at a few minutes ago. Life in the trees demanded a very specific set of tools, and evolution, working blindly, one small advantage at a time, started building them. Hands that could actually grip a branch instead of just walking across it. Eyes that gradually moved from the sides of the head toward the front, creating a wider field of view for something far more valuable in a world of gaps and falling. Depth perception, the ability to judge, in a fraction of a second, exactly how far away the next branch really is. These were the first primates. Not humans, not even close to humans. Small, wide-eyed creatures that most people today would mistake for a squirrel or a lemur. But they were carrying a genetic toolkit that almost no other mammal group had. Grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and, gradually, brains that were slightly larger relative to their body size than those of their neighbors. None of this happened because it was heading somewhere. Evolution doesn't have a destination in mind. Those traits were simply useful in that specific moment for staying alive in the trees. But that same toolkit would turn out to be exactly the equipment needed for almost everything that came next. From here, the story accelerates, though it would still take an almost unimaginable amount of time by human standards. Millions of years passed. Primates split into different branches, some staying small, others growing larger, more social, more visually and behaviorally complex. Eventually, in Africa, one branch produced the first apes, and within that branch, somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago, a lineage split off that would eventually lead to us, walking upright, freeing up the very hands that had once existed purely for climbing. Upright walking meant hands were no longer needed for movement, and hands that are free tend to get used for other things: carrying, shaping, eventually striking one rock against another to create an edge sharp enough to cut through hide and bone. Across the following few million years, brain size in this particular lineage began increasing at a pace unusual even by the standards of the primate family that produced it. And with that growth came something stranger and harder to fossilize: increasingly complex social behavior, cooperation between individuals who weren't necessarily related, and eventually the ability to pass down knowledge, not through instinct, but through teaching. A skill learned by one person could now outlive that person entirely. None of it was fast. None of it was guaranteed. Several different human-like species walked the Earth at overlapping points in time, and for most of that history, our species wasn't the only one, and wasn't obviously destined to be the one that made it. But roughly 300,000 years ago, in Africa, a population of primates that looked essentially like the people around you today began appearing in the fossil record: Homo sapiens. And within the last several tens of thousands of years, for reasons researchers are still working to fully understand, every other human-like species that once shared this planet with us disappeared. We were, and remain, the only ones left. But here's where the story turns strange. and where the phrase had to happen starts to mean something very different than you might expect. Because the exact location of that impact wasn't just unlucky for the dinosaurs, it may have been the single most important detail in this entire chain of events. Researchers who studied the rock beneath the Gulf of Mexico found something unusual. It was, and still is, extraordinarily rich in sulfur. When that specific rock vaporized on impact, it didn't just create dust. It created enormous quantities of sulfate particles, especially effective at blocking sunlight and cooling the planet. And rock like that covers only a small fraction of Earth's surface. Most of the planet, especially the deep ocean, doesn't have it. If that asteroid had arrived at a very slightly different point along its path, even a matter of minutes earlier or later, it could plausibly have struck open ocean instead. By several scientific estimates, that impact would have released far less sulfur into the atmosphere. The skies might have cleared in weeks instead of years. A great many dinosaurs might have made it through. Think about what that actually implies. Your existence and the existence of every human being you've ever met may ultimately trace back to a matter of minutes and one specific patch of ancient seafloor in a single moment 66 million years ago. Not fate, not a plan. An extraordinarily narrow, almost accidental sequence of events that happened to break in exactly the direction required for small, tree-climbing mammals to eventually become something that could stand upright, look at the sky, and start asking where it came from. There's a question biologists still like to ask each other, half seriously. If you could somehow rewind the history of life on Earth and let it play out again from the very beginning, would anything like us ever appear a second time? Nobody knows for certain. But almost everything we've learned about that afternoon 66 million years ago suggests the honest answer is probably not. Not like this. Not with this exact set of hands, this exact set of eyes, this exact brain reading these words right now. So maybe the real reason the dinosaurs had to die isn't really about dinosaurs at all. It's about how much of what you are right now was built directly out of catastrophe, out of an ending so complete that it rewrote the rules for everything that came after. You are not an accident in the careless, throwaway sense that word usually implies. You're something rarer than that. You are what happens when the single worst day in the history of life on Earth turns out, 66 million years later, to be the exact reason there was anything left alive to remember it.